as you know, our theme is together, which as I was saying just a few minutes ago is very appropriate after a 3-year gap for a live event. I'm delighted to introduce Stephen Bayley to talk about the relationship of beauty to some notion of together. And of course, you think, well, if something's hugely popular and everybody says it's beautiful, it must be so. But how often does that happen? Isn't it the case that actually ideas about beauty are as likely to divide people as to draw them together? So we thought this was a suitably provocative subject on which to ask Stephen to speak. Stephen Bayley is an author, a critic, the co-founder and probably the initiator actually with Terence Conran of London's Design Museum, and he worked with Terence Conran for many years and has produced a rather scintillating biography with a co-author of that great man, the man who invented design. Stephen is also chair of the Royal Fine Art Commission Trust in the UK and was responsible with the director, Robert Bardry, who's in the room, for initiating the Building Beauty Awards. And they were presented for the first time in London 10 days ago by Norman Foster in his Bloomberg building headquarters. And the reason for initiating the Building Beauty Awards was really to stimulate discussion about what is it that we mean by beauty, and in particular, how does that apply to architecture and cities and urbanism and design. And the context for that is that in the UK planning system, for the very first time, has incorporated the word beauty into its guidance. So we are now instructed that to win planning permission, your building should be well designed, beautiful, and sustainable. So quite interesting that those three factors are regarded as separate rather than as sort of synonymous. Well, without further ado, I'm going to invite you to join me in giving a warm WAF welcome to Stephen Bayley.
Hello. It's a great pleasure to be together with you all. As Paul said, together is, I'm told, our theme, but let me tell you immediately, I think I'm probably going to ignore it because as Paul explained, I want to talk about beauty. I have a personal mission, which I'm glad I share with the Royal Fine Art Commission Trust, of which Paul is the deputy chairman. I want to take aesthetics out of the quiet little closet, which it's been restricted to for, I think, too long. Let's agree together that for a moment we've probably heard quite enough about sustainability, functionality, value engineering, whatever. Don't get me wrong, I'm very aware that I'm very aware of the importance of these things, but I'm equally aware of the construction industry's disproportionate contribution to pollution, and that's I think, as everybody here knows, it's something on the global architectural agenda. In the bargain we're going to have to make in future between new building and creative reuse and retrofitting. Look, I'm not denying, of course, the importance, indeed the obligation of architects to make buildings that are structurally sound and not harmful to the environment. I'm just saying that for the moment, I'm really keen on trying to concentrate on the look of things. Strangely, beauty is nowadays almost a neglected area. It's like a piece of, if you like, lost intellectual property. I often wonder, it's a very simple question, and simple questions are always the best. I often wonder, why does it appear to be so very difficult to design a beautiful building? Equally, I've found when talking to students, and here's something which just fascinates me, why is it also difficult for students? You've given them a brief saying, please design an ugly building. They actually find it very difficult. But anyway, that's just one of the many paradoxes we're discussing here. I became interested in architecture as a boy, not because I was fascinated by load paths or drain schedules or any of the other detailed bits of intricate planning which were involved in making buildings. I became interested in architecture most of all because it seemed to me the most profound expression of style. Buildings, it seemed to me, have an extraordinary influence on our notions of what is good, what is bad, what is ugly, what is beautiful. But this is not often enough recognized. I love something which was said by Robert Byron, the great English travel writer and architectural commentator, something he wrote for the coronation of George VI in 1937 and was published in the Architectural Review. Summarized, talk about commodity, firmness and delight. We've got, this might look delightful, but it clearly lacks commoditas and firmitas. Byron described architecture as this. He said, of all the arts, architecture is the nearest to the most people. It affects their happiness most closely, obtrudes on their sight most often, and this is the crucial bit, costs them least to enjoy. A poet once said that beauty is what makes us follow the path to either people or indeed places which we love. Beauty is a siren call. It's something we actually all want to follow. It's a stimulus for togetherness, if you like. Historically, I think the pursuit of beauty is what defines civilization. It's essential to well-being and cultivated life. A philosopher once said that the thing about beauty is that it conjures an illusion which protects us from the damaging realities of the rest of the world. A beautiful painting, for instance, invites us to enter and inhabit an imagined world. And a beautiful building, let me put it very simply, but I feel this very strongly, a beautiful building intensifies nothing less than our feelings of life's possibilities. I mean, just to get a sense of the importance of this, let me tell you something you never hear anybody say ever. You've never heard anybody say, I wish I were less beautiful. However, we aesthetes are not just sort of limp-wristed beauticians. You have to be quite a tough bunch, a tough individual to be an aesthete. The reason is it's actually, instead of being delightful and prompting of togetherness, I found that discussing beauty is a very, very reliable way of starting an argument. As I said, in painting, great art involves in a sense of belonging to the world it reveals. And sometimes that world, in art, in painting, can be very harrowing. Just as the surrealists said, beauty must be convulsive. But while appearances most certainly do matter, I think it's important to recognize that beauty is not just about surface effects. Our taste and appetite for beauty reveals a common desire for belonging, for identity and belief in something better than what we have at the moment. But it is, desirable as that all sounds, beauty is the most difficult subject. And that's why discussing it is so fantasizing. That's why it's so fantastic, so difficult. So it's so interesting. I've got a marvellous anecdote about beauty and the complexities of it. In London's National Gallery, there's a very famous 16th century Flemish painting by the painter Quentin Matisse. It's called The Ugly Duchess, and it shows Margaret, the Countess of Austria, who's suffering from something called Paget's disease, which is an appalling deformation of the jawbone. And she looks quite cheerful, but she's absolutely hideous. The painting is always known as The Ugly Duchess, and it was the inspiration for Summer Tenniel's illustrations of Alice in Wonderland. It also fascinated Leonardo da Vinci, who was at least as interested in grotesques and horrors and monsters as he was in the more beautiful things. Anyway, in London's National Gallery shop, the postcard of Matisse's Ugly Duchess far outsells the postcard of Monet's Water Lilies. For some reason or other, the public find ugliness especially compelling. But there are no easy answers here. I mean, the question of defining beauty bothered Plato, and then it bothered Immanuel Kant, and they were unable to provide completely convincing answers to the question of what it is. But in any case, if beauty were very easy to define, the pursuit of it wouldn't be so worthwhile. But there are, I think, about beauty some generalities which are universally true. And this is, for me, is the essence of what we're talking about. What we call beauty is a quality some things, some buildings have, some art forms have, which engage both the senses and the intellect. I mean, for instance, a sizzling steak, for instance, if you're not a vegetarian, a sizzling steak engages the senses. It enhances the appetite, but it has zero intellectual quality. Whereas, for instance, a melody by Mozart also engages the senses, but has a hell of a lot of intellectual content too. And it's the same with buildings. Here's the famous octagon of Ely Cathedral in Cambridgeshire, finished in about 1342. Now, with anyone who has a sense of space and an interest in space as well as construction, it offers those things which beauty always has. It offers a mixture of surprise, delight, thrill, and astonishment. I mentioned delight because delight, I think, is almost always, even though sometimes beauty can be horrible, it can be sublime in the way the philosopher Edmund Burke explained, we get a thrill out of gorges and mountains and thunderclaps and the cries of wild animals. Delight is always something to do with beauty. I'm now going to give, the substance of what I'm going to do is introduce you to 5 truths, or indeed half-truths, about beauty. And these are going to illustrate with just 5 or 6 more photographs from architectural history. The first one is this, and I owe this wonderful line to Serge Gainsbourg, the grizzled French chanteur. And he said, ugliness is superior to beauty because it lasts longer. And I think that's probably true if you think about it. The mystery of art, it sometimes seems to me, is not its timelessness, but its ephemerality. Another poet, John Keats, said a thing of beauty is a joy forever. But actually, we know that it's not, because the tides of taste, what we appreciate and enjoy, come and go in ways which are almost unpredictable. The only predictable thing about taste is we know that it changes. No great painter, for instance, has ever enjoyed a continuous reputation. I mean, in the 18th century, when neoclassical taste ruled, Michelangelo was considered to be just a muscular brute. Vermeer and El Greco spent most of the 18th and 19th century being completely unknown. Albert Camus knew about the frailty of the idea of beauty. Camus, who was, of course, both an Algerian national goalkeeper for the football team, as well as a popular existential novelist, actually said, beauty drives us to despair because it offers us, for a minute, just a glimpse of an eternity that we should like to stretch out over the whole of time. Maybe, perhaps, it's ugliness that's a joy forever. For instance, who can say that Francesco Borromini's magnificent campanile on Sant'Andrea della Frate in Rome, which was probably finished in about 1653, who can say whether this is actually beautiful? But let's give it a go. It's a magnificent example of Stuart Brand's apothegm that you don't finish a building, you start it. Brand, when he wrote that, wasn't thinking about the retrofitting and creative reuse, but it's absolutely right. What Borromini did here was add this fantastic addition to what is in fact a very, very dull Roman church. And what you can see here is a completely idiosyncratic composition of mixed orders, urns, and vegetable motifs. It resembles nothing built before or since. And back to the sizzling steak metaphor, it engages the senses by confronting them with its extraordinary peculiarity. But it engages the intellect too, because you want to know how this errant pupil of Michelangelo could have stretched the craft of stonemasonry so far. And you want to know as well, whatever was the meaning of this robust act of disruption. The fact that we're looking at a Borromini's Campanile on Sant'Andrea della Frate 400 years later and asking these questions proves to me the value of Borromini's design and its essential beauty. Number 2, the truth or half-truth about beauty is it it can almost always be detected, but it cannot be defined. Although I personally like the definition of the French novelist Stendhal, who said, I'll spare you my French pronunciation, but I'll translate it. He said, beauty is something which gives us the prospect of happiness. But then again, happiness is actually very hard to define. The Roman novelist Alberto Moravia said, we're at our happiest when we don't realize it. I mean, happiness is not a positive state, it's just a lack of negatives. Happiness is not when you're howling with laughter and slapping your thighs. Happiness is when just nothing really unpleasant is happening to you. And incidentally, by the way, Alberto Moravia was always very, very bored. He used to walk around the streets of Rome, stopping passers-by and just saying, no, I'm very bored, I want to die. And there is actually an argument that beauty itself is boring, whereas ugliness is utterly, utterly fascinating. The Marquis de Sade, who of course made a business of rape, sodomy, poisoning, prostitution and murder and gave us the term sadism, Marquis de Sade knew that beauty belongs to the sphere of the simple, the ordinary, while ugliness is something extraordinary. And the greatest paradox about beauty is if everything was beautiful, nothing would be. I think we actually, however defined, you actually need a measure of ugliness in the world in order to appreciate beauty. I mean, if everything was beautiful, simply nothing would be. But then the question arises about quotas. Exactly how much ugliness does one need in order to enjoy beautiful things? Here's Liverpool's Albert Dock, which was completed in 1843, one of the first buildings to respond to new legislation about making fireproof industrial buildings. Of course, one of the great results of the modernist revolution was that happily we were taught to see beauty in ordinary things. Industrial buildings were once ignored, except, of course, Carl Friedrich Schinkel, the great Prussian neoclassicist, had indeed travelled to Manchester, where he saw contemporary buildings of the Albert Dock. He saw the mills and warehouses of Manchester, which fed directly into his neoclassical buildings in Berlin, which then, of course, fed directly into the German branch of the modern movement through Gropius and Mies van der Rohe. But what we have here is in Albert Dock was something which was designed to meet entirely functional obligations. As I said, it was to be fireproofed. Inside it has wonderful sort of rounded corners to minimize the damage to goods in transit. It has a unique steel structure and the extraordinary tough presence of its brick structure. I think it's a beautiful reminder of a lost age. And so too is this. Oh, sorry, I've got the wrong slide here. I'm sorry, so too is this. This is the magnificent Stockwell bus garage in South London, built in 1952. Again, why I find this beautiful, it's something to do with the senses and the intellect. The amazingly ambitious concrete spans, which at the time were the largest the unsupported concrete spans anywhere in the world, they engage the senses in this extraordinary space. So you can see how big the space is by the number of double-decker buses. That sounds like one of those newspaper metaphors, doesn't it? Something's as big as 27 double-decker buses or 27 football pitches, and here it is. But it also engages the intellect in a very different way to Borromini. It engages the intellect because it's a monument to public utility. That's to say, it has genuine meaning. This was a building built for social purpose. Okay, the third principle about beauty, which is here for you to dismiss, is that people often say, oh, you think it's beautiful, that's just a matter of opinion. Well, I actually happen to think opinions are very important because opinions are usually quite hard won. They're not arbitrary. There are two arguments against beauty being just a matter of opinion. The first belongs to an emergent study, it's not quite yet a discipline, called neuroaesthetics. Neuroaesthetics was pioneered by a London neurosurgeon called Semir Zeki, who wrote a paper called The Neural Correlates of Beauty. And what he did with neuroaesthetics is basically it brings together magnetic resonance imaging, MRI scanning, with art criticism. Zeki found you can put people's heads into a scanner, show them a painting or a building, And regardless of their race, gender, class, culture, education, the neural colonies in the brain will actually respond in the same way. And this, of course, is the basis of why the golden section always works. There's a bit in the architecture of the brain which corresponds to the 8:13 ratio of the golden section because it corresponds to the field of vision of the human eye. Now, the second reason why beauty is not arbitrary and not a matter of opinion is this, because, as I said, it's about togetherness. It's about collectiveness. Beauty is it's objective in the sense that beauty, however defined, is something we're all looking for. Who would have thought, back to the sheer poetry of industrial buildings, who would ever have thought that an administrative building, which was basically mushroom piers in a hole in the ground in an obscure northern state in America, whoever would have thought that something like this could have been inspired by poetry? The universal impression of Frank Lloyd Wright's Johnson Wax building is one of magic, fantasy, and the broadening of emotional experience. This is just an office space, but goodness me, who can deny that it is a thing of wonder? And interestingly, and I think most importantly, Frank Lloyd Wright went fully 100% over budget in the construction of it. But as Billy Wilder, the great film director, once said, "I'll tell you one thing you never hear in Hollywood." You'll never hear somebody saying, "You've got to go and see that movie. It came in under budget." Always worth bringing that. Which brings me to the next principle about beauty, which is what you might call the cash value of art. There's a social value to beauty, which we all know about. Beautiful things, beautiful environments tend to make people happier, make them more responsible, and enjoy life more. Charles Darwin explained our appetite for beauty in human beings was a survival characteristic because beautiful children are more likely to find mates, thus ensuring the continuity of the species. Or as I might put it, I may feel the need to fuse my own premium genetic material with yours so that humanity continues in the same very fine style. A pair of American economists recently defined what they call the beauty premium, which is to say that attractive children grow into attractive adults who more easily develop agreeable interpersonal communication skills and therefore make more money. So there's a cash value to beauty too. In business theory, there's a Japanese man called Noriaki Kano who has a theory, back to the word delight. It took business theorists centuries to realize that in any business process, if you can think about, as I said, sustainability, functionality, but Noriaki Kano's theory, which is a product of the 1980s, is that if you can produce delight, you've got a winning product. But delight, of course, is something that McKinseyite accountants and financial observers cannot calculate, and therefore they distrust. But I know delight's important. I know beauty has a cash value, because rather as Raymond Loewy, the pioneer industrial designer, said in his autobiography, which in French is called La laideur se vend mal, which means ugliness sells badly. And that, as Paul Finch was saying before, is at least in the UK even more relevant, because the creation of beauty in buildings has now become a government directive. And then finally, the fifth principle, of course, is something to do with beauty and sex. Sex and architecture, of course, very, very closely related. I mean, prostitution may be the oldest profession, but many people think architecture may be the second oldest profession. And Vitruvius himself, and we often cite Vitruvius, don't we? We're talking about his commoditas, firmitas, and voluptas being beauty. Vitruvius decided the classical orders of architecture had genders. Tuscan was masculine, Ionic was feminine, and the rest of it. And there are also those theorists who think that the plan of the Roman Basilica, which of course evolved as the plan of the Christian Church, many theorists, archaeologists, antiquarians think that plan is itself a graphic of the female reproductive system with its porch, its nave, and its apse and the rest of it. Anyway, beauty and sex. It would be utterly trite, of course, to describe Mies van der Rohe's 1958 Seagram building in New York as a sort of phallomorphic, but it's certainly manly in a way, in an arresting way. Mies's motto was "Beinahe nichts," almost nothing. He wanted to be good, he said, rather than interesting, which is a rather fine gloss on the idea that beauty is boring. But this building is, as I'm sure many of you visited know, it's actually sensually overwhelming. But it's intellectually engaging too, because it's complete fraud artistically. I mean, it meets the whole beinahe nichts business about making it as minimal as possible. The bronze-coloured beams on the outside are pure decoration, because fire laws didn't allow them to be. The structure had to be encased in concrete, but he was still very concerned with the decorative effects of the bronze iron. So here it is. It's slapped on as mere decoration. So what I mean to say, you've got the senses and the intellect here. Anyway, back to my final definition of what beauty is, and I owe this to a woman called Elaine Scarry, who's a professor of English at Harvard University. In fact, her full title is the magnificent Professor of the General Theory of Value, which I'd like. There's something as grandiose as that. Professor Scarry says something is beautiful if we want to reproduce it, if we want more of it. And it's worth mentioning here that in English, the word ugly comes from the Old Norse word ugga, which means aggressive. Ugliness is aggressive, whereas beauty is compellingly attractive. If we want more of it, it's probably beautiful. Sex is about vitality too, and kitsch, if you want a definition, talking about life and death metaphors, somebody once defined kitsch as being the corpse that's left when vitality leaves art. Anyway, so what is all this? I didn't mean to give you a miniature lecture on the history of architecture, but these are lovely, lovely images. So what have I been saying has got to do with architecture today? Well, as we said at the beginning, it's something of a mission which we at the Royal Fine Arts Commission Trust have to restore beauty to the national conversation. The motivation for doing this is in part because artists, or people who declare themselves to be artists, they will discuss anything today other than beauty. Take this. Brasilia was once thought to be beautiful, but the question I want to ask about Brasilia is, what is the relationship of space and locality, genius loci, to our sense of beauty? Would San Andrea della Flate, Borromini's amazing building, would it actually look slightly less interesting if it was in, shall we say, Wyoming? I don't know. Anyway, this is just like a karaoke version of Le Corbusier's Ville Radieuse. It's what happens when architects think about space in abstract terms, where you get these empty vistas full of Volkswagens and nothing else. Once thought to be beautiful, it's now, I think, universally seen as frankly a bit of a disaster. But anyway, there are no answers here, there are only questions. As soon as you ask what beauty is, you open a window onto an extraordinary vista of fascinating questions. But some essential truths remain. What we see affects us. Buildings at their best have their power to depress and their power to dismay. I know this from Liverpool. Growing up in Liverpool, not in a particular hardship myself, but in Liverpool you can't be anything other than impressed by the power of architecture to move us. It's what made me interested in what we now call design, how one arrangement of brick, steel and glass can be exalting and exhilarating. Another arrangement of the same materials can be utterly, utterly dismaying. And if you ask me, that's what design is. And of course, architecture is a branch of the larger business of design. Design is that ability to take basic materials and turn them into things of wonder. We need to be, however, I think, and I'm coming to my conclusion now, we need to be very, very wary about the idea of the design codes which in London the government is threatening to impose. This having declared that beauty is a material consideration in planning approvals, the threat is we're going to be invited to take part in an orgy of historical pastiche. I think that's entirely wrong, because apart from anything else, creativity, which is what we're talking about here, creativity tends to be completely unruly and unpredictable. I think the motive should be not to copy, but create. I love what Gustav Mahler said about tradition and creativity. He said it's a matter of tending the flame, not of worshipping the ashes. Anyway, asking questions about beauty, as I've demonstrated here, it's like trying to embrace smoke. It can't really be done. And I'd just like you to ponder, thinking about these 7 magnificent examples of architecture of the past, this central question, which again tests our feeling about what beauty actually is. Is a building great because it's beautiful? Or do we think it's beautiful because it's great? Just ask yourself that when you ponder something like Albert Dock or Johnson Wax. Anyway, Last week, as I said, my reason for being here, as Paul Finch so generously said, last week in London we had our Building Beauty Awards, and they're deliberately called thus, controversially, because there are lots and lots of architectural awards around, all of them excellent in their way, but none, I think, has declared beauty to be the absolute objective. And this week, here on Friday, we are creating the International Building Beauty Award, where I'll be judging the candidates from all over the world for the world's most beautiful building. Now, I know that's an absurd idea, but it's to start a conversation. We'll be looking at buildings from Sydney, Porto, Tehran, the Peloponnese, Indonesia, Egypt, Sharjah, and Kirkkonummi in Finland, and they'll be competing with the winner of the Building Beauty Award prize in London last week, which is the Tintagel Footbridge in Cornwall. I don't know who's going to win, and in fact, in a sense, I don't care. But of one thing I'm certain, and our International Building Beauty Awards, I hope, will prove this, the search for beauty is fundamental to civilized life. And in searching for beauty, what we're trying to do with our awards, which is going to become a cumulative thing, we're going to look for sources, not for imitation in the government's design codes. We don't want imitation, we want inspiration. We don't want to have a lot of ashes, we want to encourage a lot of flames. Thank you. I should actually add, in a shameless plug, somewhere or other you'll find a flyer because the Royal Fine Art Commission Trust has produced a little book called, not a little book, quite a big book called This Is Architecture, which is a compilation of the best writing about architecture, not by architects or architectural critics, but by writers of the stature of, Virginia Woolf, D.H. Lawrence, Tom Wolfe, Umberto Eco. And that is, again, our intention here is to try to raise the standard of architectural criticism. Anyway, thank you.
Stephen, thank you for that typically feisty and scholarly presentation. I noticed you didn't show any cars. Now, I know you love cars and you think car design has examples of kind of perfect 20th century notions of beauty. And I wonder if you'd like to make some observation about the relationship between two of your great loves, the automobile and architecture.
Well, I don't think I'm not. Paul said, I've written lots about cars, but I'm not a car enthusiast in the sense that I like driving or I like emptying sump oil or playing with gaskets. It's not what cars and architecture have in common. To me, they seem to be exactly the same thing. I once, years and years ago, went to a talk by the great Nikolaus Pevsner, who said simply, architecture is a static controlled environment, whereas a car is a mobile controlled environment. And to me, they're both the same things. I did a book some years ago about cars, and I deliberately had them photographed, with front elevation, side elevation, and plan view in order to demonstrate that fundamental similarity. It's not the cars and architecture are similar. They're to me the same thing.
And on the same sort of line, you refer to decoration, and I wonder whether you regard decoration as a sort of good modernist, as sort of the work of the Antichrist, or whether you think that actually it all depends on what its aesthetic effect is. And similarly, what's the equivalent of decoration in relation to cars? Is there any comparison here?
Well, I think my own taste drives me towards classic mid-century modernism. I like things which are spare and spare and lean, clean lines. But I recognise that is just a personal preference. I've always been fascinated, but to make distinctions between design, which seems to be a relatively technical subject, that you can define design in a building or in a car or whatever by asking simple questions like, does it work? How much does it cost? Is it fireproof? Does it last a long time? And is it a commercial success? All those questions have an answer which has yes to them. And it's like the Daily Mail says in its headlines, whether or the theory behind the Daily Mail is never ask a question which gets no for an answer. And it's this. Let me answer it in this way, as the politicians say. I think most of the time when people talk about design, they're actually talking about taste. They're talking about what they like and what expresses their preferences. As I said, I'm spiritually and fundamentally a modernist, and I believe in all those. I believe in all that stuff. But it was just poetry. It was just fantasy. There's no, all those modernist tropes, truth to materials. That's fine if you're dealing just with stone or glass or brick. But what sort of truth does PTFE beg to express? I mean, no one knows. And it's the same with car design. There's very little which is truly functional in it. I mean, aerodynamics is still a black art. People know what you must not do in designing an efficient car, aerodynamically speaking. But what you can do, there's almost an infinite variety of solutions. I think I followed the modernist writ about applying, the Adolf Loos stuff about ornament and crime and applied decoration. If it's unintelligent, is nonsensical. But there are forms of decoration which are sensible. And here I go back to that. One of my favourite definitions of what design, and there are as many definitions of design as there are of beauty. I love it that Le Corbusier said, "Good design is intelligence made visible." And I think that's worth applying to both buildings and cars.
My favorite definition of design is that design is the tribute that art pays to industry. It's only my favorite because I thought of it. I want to ask you about one of your the great hero and villain in your life, Terence Conran, and whether he ever talked about beauty. I mean, he talked about design a lot, but did he have a kind of any sort of convincing or long-term ideas about the relationship of aesthetics to design?
Well, I think Terence Conran did. I don't think I'd ever heard Terence use a polysyllabic word like aesthetics. I mean, he was tend to be more interested in very simple words and simple things. But Terence's motivation was what he liked to call, and he was a great Francophiliac. He was called l'art de vivre, the art of living. And back to my senses, my thing about beauty is something which engages both the senses and the intellect. Terence Conran was, I think, what made him a powerful and interesting figure. What he was, in one sense, was an almost demented hedonist, bent on pleasure in every form it could take. Wine, women, cars, cigars, fine wine, but also had he had the motivation of a hedonist, indeed of a voluptuary, but the aesthetics of a Puritan. He liked simple things. I mean, Terence would always point out, and I must say I agree, that a single fine daffodil in an ordinary glass milk bottle is very, very often more affecting and lovely than an entirely eclectic floral display on the Constance Spry lines put in a cut glass bowl. I think Terence Conran's overall motivation, and it's something I share this with him exactly, is that the appearances matter. You can tell by appearances. And while Terence wouldn't have recognised his debt to John Ruskin, I think the fundamental Conran view of the world was that anything that's made reveals the beliefs and preoccupations of the person who made it. You can actually, as Henry Ford said, you can read any object like a book if you know how. And I think Terence believed everything. Again, Terence wouldn't talk about morality, but essentially he believed that things that are made had a moral character. That's to say, they were good or bad. I used to have endless arguments with him about. Terence would say to me, "Tell me, is this good design or is it bad design?" And I would say, "Well, it's not quite as simple as this." And then he would always say, "Why do I employ you if you don't know your own mind?" But anyway, it was a moral view of things, that anything that's made reveals certain truths.
I wanted to ask, you mentioned the work being done by neuroscientists and trying to sort of make some sort of collation between brain impulses when looking at images. And it reminded me of a government design guide, which indeed has many images of what it claims are beautiful buildings without ever defining what beauty is, as usual. And what struck me when I was looking at this, that actually what was beautiful was the photographs. And this business about saying that things are beautiful or ugly, which are three-dimensional, and in fact, because of time, they're four-dimensional in real life. We're invited to pass comments on them, at planning committees, on the basis of two-dimensional images at the wrong scale. I mean, this is peculiar.
I think you're referring, aren't you, to the Building Beauty Commission report, and this was completely absurd. It was well intentioned, as I said. Anything which ventilates ideas about beauty seems to me to be worthwhile, and I have no argument with the idea that appearances are important. But I think buildings have to be judged as a whole, not in photographs. And for our awards, all the judges visited every building where at least one of the judges visited every building we're considering. But this is why I'm sort of really worried about the government's idea of design codes, because the suggestion is. And it was initiated by the late philosopher Roger Scruton, and this is a report of such intellectual mediocrity. Scruton, who was an academic philosopher, would have thrown it out if it had been the work of a first-year student, because it just presents, in the most simplistic way, photographs saying "dunk," Seagram building ugly, and "dunk," something with either a OG arch or a pediment beautiful. And as I've pointed out, there are no truths about beauty. There are lots of questions. It just takes many, many forms, but it certainly doesn't take the form which the Building Beauty Commission thinks it does.
I think that's a splendid combative note to end on. A fascinating way to start our sessions on this main stage. Stephen Bayley, thank you very much indeed.